Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Danielle Cooper, and I will be your moderator today. Thank you for joining us. Our event today is titled Sex Offense Recidivism Risk, Not What You Think. As I mentioned, we're here to have a discussion. I think that you will be able to engage, learn, ask questions. And so once again, my name is Dr. Danielle Cooper. I bring you greetings from the University of New Haven, where I'm an associate professor of criminal justice, and I also serve as the director of research at the Tau Youth Justice Institute. I am very humbled to be able to moderate today, as I have a large passion for this conversation and have been researching in this area for about the past decade. So first, I'd like to turn to our host, so I'll pass to you, Cindy.
Good morning. Thank you, Danielle. I would like to just read a brief statement. My name is Cindy Prizio. I'm Executive Director of One Standard of Justice. OSJ is a volunteer-based civil rights organization committed to ensuring that persons accused or convicted of sexual offenses in Connecticut are treated constitutionally and fairly by the state before, during, and after their sentences. We believe communities are safer with rational laws and with a focus on prevention of sexual harm and the healing of all those affected by it. We believe any sexual offense is one too many. And I'd be remiss here if I didn't mention, when speaking of healing for all, we believe in the education and practice of victim-centered restorative justice offered as an alternative to the adversarial criminal justice system for all offenses, especially violent crime. And that's a story for another day. Every aspect of our legal system, our laws and our public policies have been built around a false premise ever since Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy quoted a factually inaccurate Psychology Today article from 1986, claiming the risk that people who have been convicted of sexual offenses will commit new crimes is frightening and high. The truth is astonishingly different. I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Karl Hanson for accepting my invitation to speak with us today. Karl is not only the co-developer of the Static 99R, the most widely used risk assessment tool in the world, but he has also done extensive research on the recidivism of people who have committed sexual offense. My hope is that today, based on the work of internationally respected expert Dr. Hanson, we can definitively set a new baseline in Connecticut about the real facts, what the real facts are about recidivism. We have a broad group of stakeholders today. Welcome, and welcome the diversity as we look for common ground. This is the first of a short series of informational webinars that OSJ will be introducing across the 2021 legislative session. So please, we encourage you to continue the journey with us. A heartfelt thank you to our MC, Dr. Danielle Cooper, who I call friend and colleague in this work. We look forward to the continuation of our connection, Danielle, and our partnership, our work together. Now I'd like to introduce Senator Gary Winfield, who has shown through his work he's able to lean into the tough conversations. A heartfelt thank you to Senator Winfield for his support, his encouragement, for sponsoring today's webinar. But most importantly, I thank the senator for bringing his open mind and heart to this justice issue that affects so many and causes a broad array of emotional responses. Senator Winfield.
Thank you, Cindy, and good morning to everyone listening. I'll be brief. When Cindy contacted me about doing this webinar, I really wanted to do it. I do a lot of work in the criminal justice arena, and the work that we have done around this issue has really been impacted seriously and negatively by a lack of information. And I think it is critical that if we are to do the work of making our communities just and safe, that we have the appropriate information for whatever issue we're talking about. And this issue hits close to home, not only because I'm the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, but because when I was younger, some of you may know, a sexual-based offense was committed against me. And so I have lived on both sides of this issue as an advocate. Um, but what is most important, and I've often quoted James Baldwin in my work, and one of the quotes that I've used the most because it's appropriate to the work that we do is that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy of justice a justice can have. And when you have people who are in the business of creating policy and they don't have the appropriate information or they have misinformation, then what we create are systems to deal with the problem that do not deal with the problem, that mask the problem, that make the problem harder to deal with. We've seen in some parts of the country where people on our registries have disappeared because they just can't live their lives. We've seen people who are less likely to commit crimes in the future after they've committed a crime be treated as if they're the most likely. We've seen all kinds of things. And look, I don't believe that having the same information means we're going to agree. But certainly, if we rely on misinformation or a lack of information, and we only rely on what we feel, then the things that we put forward aren't dealing with the situation at hand. And so the work this morning is to deal with that aspect of this. These offenses that we're talking about are some of the most intimate, and so people's emotions are deeply involved. But as policymakers and people who are interested, we have to bring information to bear so that we can create the most just system possible. So I want to thank One Standard of Justice and Cindy for her advocacy. And I know I should probably know who I'm throwing to next, but I do not. So I'll need a little bit of help there. So I'm going to go back to Dr. Cooper.
Good job. I'm here to catch. I just want to thank once again One Standard of Justice and you, Senator Winfield, for taking the time to really set the tone for this important conversation. There is work to be done here. That work falls into a lot of places and spaces where we share values. We share values around racial and ethnic disparity. We share values around social justice and restorative justice. We want connections. We want knowledge. We want to reduce misinformation. I myself really have come to know a lot about this topic, about community attitudes toward individuals who are registered, about different instances that have occurred. And it really continues to stun me, the lack of the amount of misinformation and the lack of clarity that sometimes we get. So we really have a special treat with Dr. Hanson. Before I introduce him, I just want to make sure to do a little housekeeping. If you're here with us today live, we want you to know that the question and answer feature of the webinar is available to you. So if you have a question, please go ahead and drop those questions. Dr. Hanson will be giving a presentation. This presentation is recorded. We will be sharing information following the event, so to help you continue to know and grow about this topic. And so now let me introduce to you our speaker. Dr. Karl Hanson is one of the leading researchers in the field of risk assessment and treatment for individuals with history of sexual offending. He was originally trained as a clinical psychologist. He has been a researcher. He's been a research manager in the areas of correction and crime policy for Public Safety Canada between 1991 and 2017. Dr. Hanson, throughout his years, has published more than 175 articles. This includes several highly influential reviews that really capture the big picture of this discussion. He is the leading author of the most widely used measure for risk assessment and needs of individuals with a history of sexual offending. This is called the Static 99R, but there are also additional iterations of it, the 2002R and the Stable 2007. He has received career contribution awards from the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, Public Safety Canada, the International Association for the Treatment of Sex Offenders, and the Criminal Justice section of the Canadian Psychological Association. He brings us greetings today from Canada, where he's based in Ottawa. He's currently an adjunct professor in the psychology departments of Carleton University and Ryerson University. And he is the president of the non-for-profit organization SARNA, which is the Society for the Advancement of Actuarial Risk and Needs Assessments. Most simply put, we have a treat here. I hope that you listen. I hope that you come with an open mind. I hope that you really prepare to ask questions that help move us forward in 2021 with the work there is to do. Thank you very much, and I'll turn to you, Karl. I'm sorry, Dr. Hanson.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Okay. Greetings all. I think this is really important. I'm really pleased to be here. I think that as the presenters said, that we want evidence to guide our decisions. This is a more lighthearted way of thinking about it. But if you don't have evidence to guide our decisions, it's likely that we won't be going exactly where we want to go. So what I'm going to be doing today is provide a brief overview. I hope to talk for about half an hour. And then after that, we'll have some more questions. I'll be talking fairly quickly. I'll be going over things fairly like at a broad level. If you're interested in the details, almost everything here is being written up in longer articles. And you feel free to communicate with me or Cindy to get copies of the articles that on which this is based. So again, this is an overview for discussion. Just very basic discussion of what it was that we're talking about. We're talking about sexual offenses and sexual offending. There's basically two motivations for, or two definitions of what the problem is. One is, I guess, a lack of consent. So people having sexual relationships with people who either do not consent or are incapable of consent, you know, children or people in vulnerable positions. And also offenses against public morals or indecency, things like prostitution or indecent images, and which may or may not involve a non-consenting victim. I'll be mostly focusing on the non-consent types of sexual offending, though I'll make some passing references to other types of sexual offending as well. This is somewhat old data. It's Canadian data, but the US data look very similar. If you're looking at who are the victims of sexual offense, it's mostly young women, and quite young, meaning teenagers, who are the most likely victims. A smattering of boys are also in there, but it's mainly men offending against, or males offending against women is the biggest category. If you look at the people who are doing the offenses, it's men or males. One thing to notice, though, let's see if I can get my cursor here, is that there's really two humps or two distributions. The highest risk period, and this surprises many people, is just at the beginning of adolescence. So the highest risk time to commit a sexual offense are individuals who are young males who are just developing their sexuality. And so a lot of this, I really think there's two different distributions here. There's sort of a juvenile distribution, and then there's a second adult distribution, which peaks somewhere in the 30s. If you look at the adults who have been convicted of a sexual offense, and you roughly divide them into those who have adult victims, child victims who are unrelated, or related victims, what you find is the unrelated, the women largely, or adult victims, are the youngest, mostly in the 20s. The unrelated children, it's early 30s, and the related children, it's in the 40s. And this is sort of makes sense because you have to be a certain age to have related children. If you don't, but you see that pattern. The other thing to notice is that this area is not very well populated. The over 50s, over 60s, there's a few people in that group, but it's quite rare. So sex offending, like other types of crime, is largely the younger half of life, or so to speak, and not so much an old person's game. In terms of the relationship between the offender and the victim at the time of offending, mostly it's either acquaintances or family. Family is more for child victims. Acquaintances is very common for child victims as well. Strangers is relatively rare. It does happen. Strangers are more commonly adults as opposed to children. Friends are sort of a common pattern as well. So that people, if you're looking at who's offending against who, it is people who know each other and have been in relationship. That's where the offending, there is some stranger danger. There is a few people who will go off and sort of look for strangers, but that's a small slice of the problem that we're dealing with. Victimization rates. Yearly incidence of being sexually victimized is 1 to 2%. And lifetime rates are substantially high. They accumulate over time. So 20 to 40% of women, 2 to 10% of men. This is way too high. We don't like this. There is some evidence that the rates are going down over time and that some of the broad societal changes that are happening are decreasing some of these rates. But it's still a common problem. And it's, I guess for me, when I first heard statistics like this, it was troubling. And I think, like, are those really true? And then, I just started asking people, tell me about your background. Did this happen to you? And, those numbers look pretty much like what the numbers look like. It's very common in any group of women, like professional women, women who are in, just people you meet at the gym or whatever. If you talk to them and they ask you, what I do, and you get into a conversation, it's very, very common to hear histories of people. And again, the histories are usually histories of being women who are being victimized by family members or coaches or people in their relationships. That's the problem that we're seeing. Much of this is not reported to the police. Most of it is not reported to the police. Some of it is, and people get involved in court cases. But the court process is actually very aversive to victims, and it's not something that people take on lightly. In terms of the perpetration, if you ask the males, have they committed a sex offense? This is like questionnaires. Have you ever, had sex with somebody against their will, or questions like that? You get about 5 to 20% admitting that they have done that. If you look at the conviction rates, it's 1 to 2% of the male population are likely to be convicted prior to the age of 40. So it's a big enough problem that the numbers are actually reasonably high. And if you look at, I guess, another comparison, which I'll come back to again, is if you're looking at the rates of sexual offending amongst community males, you get some number, but you also get a number among people with any criminal history, which is about 1 or 2% after 5 years. So if you're looking at what is the population risk that we're dealing with, the population risk comes from largely young males. It also comes from a large group of people who may not have any sort of prior sex offense history. Okay, so this is the just basic review of data. So if you're looking at, if you're trying to compare, if you're going to treat people as if they're, quote, sex offenders, they should have a perceptibly higher risk of sexual offending than other people. And so one of the way that you can look at this is what's the rate of, spontaneous, out of the blue sex offending among people with no prior criminal history for sex offending. Now, this particular data are individuals who have, essentially males, who have a criminal conviction for something other than sex. And what you look at is the sexual recidivism rates after 5 years. And the numbers here, these are bigger samples, the hundreds of thousands. These are smaller samples in the lower thousands. These are the rates. It goes up to the high is 6% in one particular study. It goes down to half a quarter percent. Most of them are below 2%. And lucky to have some specific data from Connecticut, and about between 1% and 2% of the people who have been involved in the criminal justice system, but not for a sex offense, will likely have a sex offense conviction after 5 years, like 2%. In other words, out of 100 people like that, you'll get 2 who will be caught for a sex offense and over that period of time. So one of the things that I'm sort of using or thinking about is what I call a desistance threshold, which is if we're going to treat people as a risk for sexual offending, they need to be perceptibly higher risk than people we won't treat that way. And so we have to define some threshold. And the threshold, which I think is plausible, is something around like 2% after 5 years. So if people with a sex offense history or without a sex offense history are unlikely to reoffend, then let's not treat them, let's not manage that risk. They probably have other things that need to be worked on. So this is what I define as the desistance threshold, which is 2% after 5 years, which means that 98 out of 100 will not return to the criminal justice system for a sex offense. Okay, next. Nature of harm. Sexual offending is one of the most serious crimes. As the previous introduction says, it's something that we really don't want. Any new sex offending is problematic. And particularly it's incestuous abuse, abuse of parental figures towards their children, which is most psychologically damaging. And when you're looking at the nature of harm, there's the harm and the likelihood. And mostly what I'll be talking about in the next is the likelihood, and not so much the specific types of harm. I guess another thing for policy development is that the psychological harm is largely unrelated to physical harm. People who have been bruised up or injured in a sexual offense tend not to be as anymore traumatized than people who are coerced into it. So the actual amount of physical injury or overt threat is, it's punishable and it's, clearly wrong, but it's not highly correlated or related to the amount of trauma that the people the victims of these crimes experience. Sex offense recidivism rate. So this is a summary of rates across a number of different studies. Big circles are bigger studies. This is the length of follow-up, up to 20 years. Lots of variation. I did include some Connecticut figures here, which are just 3 to 5% after 5 years, which are not that unusual. Some of these other ones you get higher. These little dots here are small samples of very high-risk individuals. Most of the bigger samples are sort of around the 10, 15, maybe 20% range. We'll look at these in a little more detail. So if you want to summarize a lot of different studies, you end up with sexual recidivism rates of people with a sex offense history between 5 and 15% after 5 years. After 10 years, the cumulative rate goes up to about, I guess, between 8 and 20%. Lifetime rates are about the same as 20-year rates. There's very little reoffending after 20 years. It's like negligible. And it's between 10 and 30% in the studies when you follow samples for as long as we're able to follow them. Just to make the distinction between the cumulative rate and the I guess, residual risk. At the bottom line here, you have the rates, you know, say you have a 14% rate at 5 years, which is the high end of the estimates. It may go up to 20%, then may goes up to 24% after the next 5 years. But in the first 5 years, it's 14%. Then it goes down to 6%. Then it goes down to 4%. And then it goes down. And we'll see this again. I'll come back to this later, that the rate, the residual risk declines substantially with time. The highest risk period is just when they get out of prison or just after they're sentenced. That's the time when you need to pay most attention. And if they survive for a number of years, like 5 years, 10 years, their risk substantially decreases. Not all cases have the same risk. Higher risk cases are people who sexually assault adult women. Unrelated boys is particularly high. Lowest is the related girls. So it's the father, stepfather, and nieces and daughters type of relationship. You can take factors like the relationship to victim and the age and sort of demographic factors and combine them. This is the static 99 risk tool that, that Danielle mentioned earlier. Has basic criminal history factors as well as demographic factors. And you can make, you know, group people on their relative recidivism risk. This is just an example, or this is some of the information you get from static 99 scores. You're divided into roughly 5 categories from average risk. This is what you see in the middle of the risk distribution, down to very low risk and as well above average. And you have recidivism rates that go here, as well as relative risk and percentile ranks. So if you have a score in the middle, you know, you can describe people as higher or lower risk, and you can also associate some recidivism rates. Just take a look over here. This is the middle group. In the middle group, once you control for risk, the people in the middle have approximately, say, a 4 to 8% sexual recidivism risk after 5 years, which is very consistent with the recent Connecticut data. Just going to talk a moment or two about these risk levels. We spent a bit of time trying to develop a language for describing risk in the criminal justice system. And this was U.S. Council of State Governments, the Justice Center of the U.S. Council of State Governments, and myself and some individuals from public safety worked on a scheme of describing it. And there's roughly 5 levels. The first level is basically individuals who are not, who've made a mistake, but are generally pro-social. They're not criminal types, really. Or people who have offended in the past, but are not, that's many, many years ago. Level 2 are people who have some minor concerns that you may want to, it's sort of a classic community supervision, case management type of case. The level 3 is the sort of typical problems for individuals. You know, that's the big middle. That's where most of the people in the criminal justice system would fall in level 3. But then you end up with level 4s, which are above average risk. These are people who often have, you know, chronic problems with rule violation. You're at level 4, you often end up with criminal identity. So people think of themselves as offenders or as, you know, gang members or things like that. And at level 5 is, you typically only see level 5 in sort of prison type settings. And these are people who are very likely to reoffend, and often they require very secure management. Not a big group, but it's somebody who you probably worry about. Now, this is a schema for general. And if you look at it for sexual crime, it's pretty similar. So the level one is these tend to be older or pro-social individuals or people who have offended in the distant past. You have level two, which is more like the community supervision cases, minor concerns. Level three, typical problems. And level 4A and 4B. We don't have a level 5 for sex offending because there isn't a virtually certain group for sexual offending. The highest rates that we see are somewhere around the 40, maybe 60% rate if we're at the high end. Even the highest risk individuals for sexual offending don't have 80, 90% rates. We just don't see that ever. So in terms of intervention or correctional intervention, the very low risk guys are already below the desistance threshold, and really we don't need any intervention for those, whether that's for general or sexual. These are like, it's nothing like you're getting down to very, very small levels. Below average, you probably want case management, something like community supervision, some help out to make sure, perhaps some monitoring. Once you get into level 3, then you start looking at more intensive community programs. And this applies both to juveniles and to adults. And there's some good evidence that if you provide about 100 hours or maybe a little bit more of change-focused interventions, that you're able to decrease their recidivism risk from a level 3 to a level 2. So they move it down. For level 4s, you want more. So level 4s are, you want 200 to 300 hours of intervention. Often it's fairly intensive for over long periods of time. And these are, it's just harder to change people. Most people just though are in level 3 or below. These do exist, but about 20%, 15 to 20% would be in level 4 of the distribution. And that's where you would really want to spend your resources. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about desistance effects. And basically, I'll just read this. This is a quote from Kurlichuk, who's done a lot of research in the area. Basically, the general tendency for recidivism risk to decline over time is among the best replicated results in empirical criminology. It is probably not an exaggeration to say that any recidivism study with more than a 2 or 3 year follow-up period that did not find a downward sloping marginal hazard would be immediately suspect. And by marginal hazard, meaning lower risk over time. And I think that most criminologists and people who've looked at it would agree with that statement. Just give you some data. This is one of the early famous studies by Blumstein and Nakamura. Here's the reference. And what you see here is comparing, these guys were particularly concerned about background checks. We spend, I don't know how much time getting background checks for criminal history. If I want to do criminal history research, I got to get my fingerprints taken to make sure that I'm not, on the wrong side of the law. We spend a lot of money on that. Does it make a difference? And basically what they're arguing is that in the short term, yeah, but in the longer term, that after, 10 years, or in this case, 8 years, the people who have the criminal record, if they've stayed clean, start looking like everybody else. And so this is a case, with Nakamura and Blumstein, they looked at various different combinations. So somebody at 18 who has arrested for robbery, after 7 years, they sort of look like the general population. This is actually Dutch data, but what you see is the same thing. The highest risk periods in the first couple of years. By 5 years, things start to level out. By 10 years, they're not meaningfully different, and it's really not after 15 years. That's general recidivism. But it doesn't quite apply to everybody. So the lowest risk guys, see if I find my cursor. Yeah, the lowest risk guys, it's about 5 years. The higher risk guys, it's 10, 15 years. But even the highest risk guys, by 20 years, they're back down into the sort of quote normal range. This is UK data, basically showing the same thing. These are months since discharge and a wide variety of different offenses. all show this declining hazard. And in this case, it's about 5 years out. Most of them are back down to the sort of normal range. Juveniles, in general, the time to desistance for juveniles is shorter. It's mostly 5 years, like back down to looking at normal levels. For adults, it tends to be a little longer, not all the time, but it tends to be a little bit longer. Okay, I'll look next at very specifically around people with a sex offense history. I'll describe two or I guess 3 papers we've done on this topic. And what we're looking at is these are fairly large samples, 7,000 or 8,000 cases, and we look at fairly long-term follow-up, like 20-year follow-up of these cases. I just basically said that. Okay, so we start with a survival curve, just to help you read what these things are. So these are years out to 23, 24 years. Latest is 25. And we've roughly divided the sample into 3 groups, roughly thirds, the lower third, middle third, and upper third. And these are survival curves. So everybody exists, cursor up here, at the time of release. So nobody here is offended. And when they reoffend, they're taken out of and the rest are followed. And so what you see here is that the high-risk group sort of drops off, and after, say, 10 years, there's 30% or so after have reoffended, and after 20 years, it's, I don't know, 35 or so percent. So it drops off fairly steeply. The low-risk group putters along less than 5% or roughly 5% after about 20 years. Okay, and the middle group's in the middle. Okay, now what happens if you take the same data, essentially, and only look at the people who have survived 5 years? There you go. And what you get now is that the high-risk group are still reoffending more than the other groups, but they sort of look like the medium risk group now. And the medium group looks low, and the low group looks even lower. Okay, now let's follow them for another 5 years. And so we're out to 10 years. And now everybody looks like the low risk group. So the high risk group is still, slightly higher reoffending rate, but everybody is now offending at rates that look much like the low risk group, and the low risk group is very low indeed. Okay, and this effect is very general. The time-free effect is basically the recidivism risk is cut in half for each 5 years that an individual remains sexual offense-free in the community. And it applies across risk levels, across age, country, year of release, the victim type. So it is all very consistent. Another way of looking at the data, and we sort of organized it in a different way in this paper, similar sample, but not exactly the same, in terms of time to desistance here. So this line here, the black line, is the desistance threshold, and we've roughly divided people by STAC 99 scores into 5 levels. The lowest risk group are already below this desistance threshold. The level 2 below average group has about 5 years. The average, so this is the middle group, it's about, I don't know, 10, 11 years out. The highest risk group, it's 15, and the higher, and the highest risk group, it's around 20 years, everybody. But everybody basically makes the desistance threshold after about 20 years, regardless of their initial risk, if they're able to stay sexual offense free, which is not everybody. Other researchers find the same effect, just showing this isn't a fluke for us. This is the same thing. We've developed tables, so you can empirically, starting out with a particular score, say what their risk level would be after, 1 to up to 20 years. And we also have number tables. So if you start somebody whose initial risk, say in the middle, was lifetime risk was at 10%, after 10 years, that their residual risk would only be 2%. And after 15 years, you're down. But look, the numbers at 15 years are all small, regardless of where people start. And some of these people are starting at pretty high risk. We're starting at risk levels at 30, 40, 50% in the highest risk groups. But by the time they get out 15 years, they're down in small numbers. And at 20 years, they're basically down to zero. The zero at 20 years is sort of a bit artificial, but the 19 is actually real. So people decline. So all I'm saying here is there's sort of a mechanical way of estimating these risks if you wanted to do that. So what's happening? So why do we have these pervasive desistance effects? One is referred to as frailty, is that the highest risk cases, the guys who are real trouble, fail and they're taken out of the sample. So we identify them as recidivists and they go back in the system. But I also think that there's real change, that people change both in their risk relevant propensities, their impulsivity or sexual preoccupations or whatever, and people change in their intentions. Crime is something we decide to do. It doesn't just happen to us. And so we change our minds about how we want to live our lives. Sometimes you think about, people with a history as sort of these twisted, grown, sort of structure, that they're very rigidly in place. And you can look at people that way, but I think that people are actually much more flexible and much more, I guess, more opportunity to change. One of the, if you look at the broad sweep of life, people are continuously changing. And there's a Benjamin Franklin quote, that is the nature of living. You're developing, you're no longer a kid, you're no longer a young person, you're no longer, you become older and, and then you become very old. And each stage requires different sort of adjustments. And crime and crime involvement is largely a, young person's game, and people tend to move out of it. So I think in terms of what helps people to change, I think psychological interventions help. I think aging does have an effect. Part of it's physical decline. It's just harder to do things when you're, harder to, beat people up if you're older. But also with aging, we increase self-control and psychological maturity. I think with the populations that we're talking about, I think another thing is that there's increasingly rewards from a pro-social life, that once you're able to get out of the system just a little bit, you start to have things that actually matter to you that aren't sort of crime involved, and things like success in work or hobbies, or you end up with decent friends. A caring, intimate partner is a really important desistance factor. And as time goes on, you get increased dependence. You realize that you can't live it alone. You have to live with other people. And if we all work together, it sort of works out better. And it's something which it may take a while to learn, but almost everybody does. So just in terms of my summary statements of implications, is that if you're thinking about sex offense risk of people with a sex offense history, it really makes sense to sort individuals into risk levels. Like they're not all the same. Some are substantially high risk. A lot of them are much lower risk, and many are very manageable. Invest the most resources in the highest risk cases. There's the above average risk. These people you probably do want to invest some special resources into. Some of the very low risk cases, you don't need it. It just doesn't make a difference. And the other point, and I guess this is the point that we may have been dropping the ball a little bit on, is in revising risk levels. We tend to think of risk as static. I have the stack 99, but risk it's fluid. People's risk changes over time, and for most people, that risk declines. So I just encourage, when you ever develop a policy about sex offending management or that it also considers changing the risk levels of people over time. So with that, I've we'll stop and consider questions.
Hello, I think you, yes. We have a good amount of questions. I think I'm going to start with just some clarifying questions I see from the audience. So we're having a conversation about recidivism. That's a very important measurement in the criminal justice field. Can you just tell us, is that arrest, conviction? Like,
Yeah.
what are you referring to?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. It's mostly arrest, and some of the studies are arrest, some of the studies are conviction. With the sex offenses, you often know who the person is, like they're not strangers. So when you report to the police, you also report with the name of a person. So probably half the studies are arrest, probably half the studies are conviction, and depending on where you're looking, those are closer or farther apart. But it's so I essentially think of as returned to the criminal justice system is probably the best definition.
Can you comment on the follow-up period? So you mentioned several studies and you said, well, after this amount of time, they did or did not, have evidence of recidivism. Is that after release or after incarceration? I was asking.
Yeah, so the start time for the follow-up starts at the time, if you're incarcerated, it starts when you're released from incarceration. If it's a community sentence, it starts at the date of the sentence. It's basically the first opportunity to reoffend after being released, after being caught or sanctioned for the index sexual offense.
You also helped explain that there are often descriptors as levels to understand the risk of individuals involved in sex offenses. Can you help us understand the distribution of that? Are there a high amount of low offenders, a high amount of high risk offenders?
Yeah. So the levels were created essentially so that most people, half of them, are in the middle. So you have level 3, the middle range, which we had recidivism rates of say 4 to 8%. That's half of them. And so let's say there's 25% lower risk than that, whose rates are lower than 4%. And there's say 25% whose rates are higher than 8%. Is one way of saying it. So it's basically centered around the middle group, the level 3.
I have a question that says, can the lower recidivism rate over time reflect our inability to detect offending behavior, or that we are less focused on offenders? So this feels like either missing data, or are we not, enforcing? Can you offer an opinion about that?
Yeah, so I don't think the desistance effect is related to a detection effect. It might be. There's probably some involved in that. If you have good community supervision, and this is probably a question from a community supervision officer, if you have good community supervision, you actually decrease the rate of offending. You find all sorts of breaches and violations and things like that. But the rate of offending stays down if your community supervision is appropriate and tight. And so when you stop supervision, then you actually get a bit of a bump up in the rates. So the detection, again, where we find it's the victims coming forward was where we find about these offenses. It's not so much it's not like we're roaming around and finding these people offending. We don't do that. We find them like violating curfews, we find them drinking, we find them all sorts of things, but we don't actually, the system doesn't find people offending. We find the offenses through the victims. And I don't think this is an effect based on surveillance. There may be some individuals who become particularly skilled at hiding, but I don't think that's the main effect going on here.
I think that question also gets really tricky because when we're talking about individuals who have been registered, then those are highly monitored. Often, they have to report, they have to do various things, versus the idea, I think many times people have this looming person, right, that just is in the community in their minds and no one detects them for some long, amount of time. And so I think your answers really are important to, once again, helping people get information that can really address some of these other pieces. I have a clarifying question from one of our guests. You mentioned recidivism rates going down, but they said that according to your list, it seems that after 10 years or more, that it went up. So I just wanted to give you a chance to clarify.
Yeah. I tried to say this in different ways, and I've said it in different ways, and it is confusing. So let's say that the rate, the first 5 years, or maybe I can go back. Yeah, I won't try to do the slide. Over time, the cumulative rates must go up. So if it's 5% in the first 5 years, if you follow them longer, it can't go down, right? The cumulative rate will have to be 5 plus something if there's some other thing between 5 and 10 years. So that would be, it might be 7, or there's some, but the rate per year or the rate per goes down, very clearly goes down over time. So there's a difference between the cumulative rate, you add it all up, versus the current risk or the residual risk. And I guess that's the distinction. And it's a little tricky as you present it. So the basic message is it goes down, and it clearly goes down in whichever way we look at it.
I think that's a helpful clarification, Dr. Hanson. Cumulative meaning acknowledging year after year after year after year, what are those numbers, even if those numbers individually each year are smaller. So
here's another example. Let's say car accidents. Young people are more likely to, young males are more likely to have a car accident than older people. However, if you ask the question, have you ever been in a car accident? An older person will probably more likely, because they were once young people, right? And so even if they're young people, they're more likely to do it. There'll be some risk after being young. So the cumulative rate, the lifetime rate, will be different than the sort of current rate.
To our audience, I love all the questions. I'm working on getting to them. Just know that we are going to stay a bit after the 10:30 slot just to try and get more questions answered. So one of the questions, actually a few of them, speak to the small number and how that impacts research. So how does so few cases being reported affect research, affect conclusions?
Yeah, it does. And the reporting is an issue. The couple things about the reporting. One is that it's not, there's a distinction between reporting of the offenses and the reporting of the offenders. So the people who are doing a lot of offending, even if the per offense is quite small, if you do it enough times, you're likely to get caught. So we don't really know what that relationship is, like how many. What we do know is that the people that show up on our system, it's very, very rare that's their first offense, real first offense. The people who end up in our system, it's often they've had many offenses, either against the same victim, like in a family type relationship, or they have, like an exhibitionist may have exposed themselves, many times before eventually getting into the system. So even though the offense rates per, the detection rates per offense is very small, or smaller, very small, the detection rate per offender is harder to tell. I think we're still wildly underestimating. And that comes back to some of the earlier statistics. If we have 1 or 2% getting caught in the population, and say 5 to 10 admitting to it, that's probably what we're looking at. The more serious offenses, I think, are more likely to be reported, but still there's lots that are not. And it's just something we have to deal with. It's, I think it's hard to make the argument that there's everybody's doing it, so to speak. because I don't think that's just that true. And I guess one of the ways that I'm dealing with it's a real problem, and I sort of acknowledge that. If you're looking at the desistance threshold, though, say at 2% rate after 5 years, there's no reason that that should be different for people with or without a sex offense history. So that if we're going to be treating these people as if they have a sex offense history, their risk should be higher than other people who we don't treat this way. And I think we can make that comparison fairly, even if we don't know what the absolute rate is. Hope that helpful.
Can you, in the comment you just made, you spoke a little bit about the varieties of individuals, even though there's small numbers who are offending. So can you just comment a little bit more about how that shows up in the small numbers? I heard you say before that it's often a more substantive chunk in the middle. Who gets detected? I think you were mentioning at the end that also has a bit of a risk relevance. Can you just highlight that?
Yeah, so the detection, frequency increases detection. That's clear. So anybody who's in our system is probably above average frequency. So, but if you anybody who's been to university or college, there's a lot of sex offending that goes on at drunken parties, for example. This is very rare. Does this show up in the criminal justice system at all? And I don't know about the offenders in these, the young males who are the perpetrators in these situations. I doubt that they go on to a lifetime of sexual offending. I suspect this is an age and stage adjustment where they make some really bad decisions and behave, abominably, but they get feedback from their social community and feedback from, the world, and they go on and do different things. So it's a type of offending which doesn't end up in the criminal justice system. If they do continue to behave the same way in multiple situations over time, yeah, then they probably will show up in our criminal stats.
I'm going to move on. My next question for you is about the registry itself. I've been asked, what is your position on the registry? Any thoughts about, as you mentioned, risk, how it ties to policy, how it ties to public safety?
Yeah, I will answer. I'm a Canadian, and we have a different view of registries in Canada. Canada has a sex offender registry, but it is private to the police. So the police have a list of people with sex offending history with addresses, and people have to register to be on the list. So they have to give information, be on the list, but it's not accessible. That being said, there's a very selective public notification that happens with individuals who go through a process and identified as being exceptionally high risk. But at any one time, there may be, 50 people across Canada on that notification, and it's only a notification for a discrete period of time. This very high risk individual is being released from this institution. Look for them in your community. And I think that makes some sense. In terms of the other thing, which in terms of registries, I guess if you're going to have a registry, you need some way of people getting off of them. So if you think that the research evidence is pretty equivocal on whether registries help or hurt in terms of the burden of sexual victimization. But if you do have one, it's pretty clear that if people have been on for 10, 15, 20 years, they're not really at risk for sexual offending. And there should be some way that these individuals are able to get off the list.
You've been speaking specifically to the opportunity to reoffend, but can you also speak to a little bit about your knowledge about life on the registry, right? Is that experience of being on the registry potentially tied into, I don't know, the ability to return to society and perform as a, properly
law-abiding citizen.
Yeah.
No, registries, well, there are a lot of different ways that registries are organized and applied. In in the States. In Canada, even though the registry isn't public, even, people don't like being on them. You know, they still complain. But in the States, there's a huge difference between non-public versus public notification registries. And the public notification is, you know, genuine barriers to, jobs, employment, residence, and, dating, getting back involved in social relationships. So I think it does create barriers and I think the cost of those barriers have to be balanced against the benefits of public protection. I'm not saying I'm saying that there probably are some benefits in certain cases, but I think you have to carefully weigh the costs and benefits of these. It's not a clear win.
We have a hefty amount of questions leaning toward application and solutions and next steps. And so which levels of risk are most responsive to restorative justice? Any opinion about that?
The goals of restorative justice are not necessarily lined up with the person who perpetrated the crime. So restorative justice is healing a community, and I think particularly, as Danielle was saying, it's dealing with some of the victim, or I guess it was Cindy who was saying, is about the value of the victim healing in the situation. So in terms of the appropriateness of restorative justice, the fundamental question isn't really the risk level of the individual, but the needs for healing and the system. In my experience with restorative justice, one of the issues is the extent to which the people are really a system. So in some cases, like Australia has a restorative justice system, which is mandatory for youth. And in some cases, it doesn't really work because they're not part of the same system. Like I just want my window fixed. The vandal broke it, and I don't really care about what's the life care, the life circumstances, and I'm not. So you have to make the decisions about whether restorative justice or not have to do more with it's more of a global of who the players, what's the nature of their relationship. And so, for example, incestuous abuse, I think, are probably most relevant to restorative justice because the family member will still be a family member regardless of what criminal justice interventions are done. And so in those cases, I think there's the greatest possibility for overall community healing. In the stranger sort of assault situation, it may have some role, but it's probably less because they're not necessarily part of the same system enduring in time. I hope that helps.
I would just add to that question asker that the restorative practices work is really expanding along the broad array of victimization that occurs through sexual offending. And that includes even heinous violence, sexual offending. And some of the approaches to that acknowledge that you would not want to be in a room with the person who caused you that much harm. And so they're moving into vicarious practices where individuals who have caused harm are engaging with people who have been harmed but aren't the person who they directly harmed. So they're still having to experience the conversation about accountability. They're still doing that psychological and emotional labor, but the goal is, as Dr. Hanson mentioned, it's really, especially as we move more toward the violent side of the victimization, it becomes really making sure that we're being careful and concerned about what the victim needs and wants in those settings. I have a question about youth, and I am a youth justice scholar, even more so than a scholar of these offenses. Has the research about underdeveloped adolescent brain impacted the labeling of adolescents as sex offenders, or has it changed how we look at the risk or interventions for them?
Yeah, probably not enough. I think that our systems are still quite, I guess, labeling of young people. I'm actually quite sympathetic. I know, like I do work all around the world, and for example, in some countries, youth is up to age 25. So they have a youth justice system that really goes up to age 25, and they have a whole different set of rules around that. So there's some, but even it's not just youth. Our brains keep moving, right? Our brains, and all the way through it, the maturity, we no, we only become adults, but we grow through adulthood, and most of us grow more pro-social and nicer over adulthood. So it's hard to draw too strong a line for anybody. So I think youth it's obvious because we can physically see them and the brain development, but adult brain development it's non-negligible either. It really keeps moving, not always in good ways, but it does keep moving. So I think we have to be soften up our perception a little bit about how people are, and allow them to sort of develop a bit more, because that's they do. If you just actually look at a broader span, there is a lot of change between who I was at who we are at 20-year-olds as 30 or 40, 50, whatever.
Our next is a comment and a question. At present, Connecticut correctional and probation authorities devote high attention and resources to sexually related offenders than to most other crimes, including crimes of high violence. Do studies and statistics support or not support the more intensive supervision and expense of sexually related offenders versus that of violent assaults, robberies, drug sales, and other?
Yeah. Short answer is no. Most cases, well, it's a tricky thing. I slide earlier about the nature of harm. Sexual offenses are scary and serious, and they are. They're scary and serious. So even a single sex offense can sort of shake up a system, whereas a single robbery probably won't. So if your goal is to supervise, is to risk manage your whole system, then it probably does make sense to add some extra weight towards people with a sex offending history. On the other hand, people with only sex offense, or people with a sex offense history, tend to be more pro-social than other people in the criminal justice system. The examples I like to give are like school principals caught with child pornography, or these people. Or I did some work with priests, for example, who can be very, very pro-social in many, many areas, but have a serious, problem with sexual deviancy. These people are actually very easy to supervise. They're obedient. They listen to what you do, and they follow rules. In some ways, devoting a lot of time and energy to these people is not an efficient use of supervision resources. So I think you can be a bit more. I think you have to recognize that sexual offending is serious. But even so, I think you can make differentiations, and you don't have to have a blanket policy that every person with a sex offense history is, maximum supervision risk.
I think those are very important clarifications, Dr. Hanson. I just want to reiterate, we want no offenses. We want no one to be victimized, and we want no one to be committing these offenses. Like, we understand the seriousness and severity of the type of harm that can be caused, but without the nuance about, especially the fact that there are low-level offenders, especially there are youth who are caught up in this conversation, especially the acknowledgement that then what we do when you are snared and you're registered, then how is that in alignment or not with promoting, like you said, a pro-social life? The question I have for you is, in Connecticut, sex offender treatment and sex offender probation look very similar for someone that is low risk versus someone that is high risk. Can you talk about how this might be doing the community and the low risk individuals a disservice?
Yeah, I'm a strong advocate for differential response. If you look at the broad research literature, the risk need responsivity model is fairly dominant and has good empirical support. And basically what it says is that you should give more resources to the higher risk cases, and the lower risk cases you do less with, or, in some case, nothing at all. And I think in terms of the language that I'm using, the level ones, providing them with like treating them as sex offenders is probably counterproductive, because their risk for sexual offending is very, very low. And it probably it's costly, both to the person who has to attend treatment and supervision and all that. But it's also costly for the system, because we have to have probation officers and community supervision treatment who are providing treatment. Like, you're not going to lower the risk below 1%. It just ain't going to happen, regardless of what you do. And it's much better to spend those, time and energy on people who have a genuine, elevated risk, and often those would be young people who have yet to be involved in the criminal justice system. So if we're concerned about the big problem of sexual victimization, yes, people with a sex offend history are worrisome, and we should take a look at them. But some of those are sufficiently low that we can then avert our gaze from that and look at something entirely different, which is the sort of the new crop of young people who are potentially at risk.
There are so many good questions. I'm gonna maybe spitfire at you in the last 5 minutes. Are there good juvenile evaluation instruments and correctional systems that use them or look seriously at broader reform and discipline?
Yeah, the juvenile assessment is less developed. There's a few that are out there. I can't give you a clear recommendation for the risk assessment, but there are a few that are plausible. They're nowhere near as developed. There's like 10 times as much research on adults as juveniles, but there are a
My
few out
research
there.
partner is listening on this call, so I'll let her know.
Yeah, there's not bad juvenile general criminal risk tools. There's a number of those out there that work reasonably well, but for juvenile sex offending, there's a couple. They have a few studies, but they're much less developed than with adults.
My next question goes to what you were saying a little bit a moment ago about non-intervention, intervention. Is there such a thing as over-intervention? Can you speak about whether or not that's counterproductive and how it might impact public safety?
Yeah, I guess most of the over-intervention can be counterproductive. You can actually, with sex offending, it's basically introducing lower risk people to higher risk people, and you can actually make them worse by doing that. So mixing, you can also create barriers to reintegration by people who would naturally be going along and do fine, and you can actually make it harder. Most of the, for me, those do happen. For me, it's just, we have a finite amount of time to do things on this planet, and let's do things that matter rather than spending time on things which are very unlikely to make a difference.
Have you spoken with victim advocates groups, and what is the message that you feel can be communicated with them?
Yeah, I started out treating victims. Like, my personal story, I started out as a clinical psychologist, and I was working with people who came into mental health, and very often they would tell a story of abuse. Sometimes it's physical abuse, but very often sexual abuse. And I don't see myself as a advocate for, well, maybe I do see myself as an advocate for victims. It's basically, I wanted to understand, and I guess what I'm working on, as I hear most of the other people here, is preventing victimization. And how do we do that best? And I chose to work with the guys because I see them as responsible. There's work to be done with victims, and I think that's really important. If I was, I guess, with terms of victims, when I do talk to them, first acknowledge their, what I feel is their heroism of coming forward. It is not easy, and that stepping up and identifying yourself as a victim and that you want to change the system is a major step. So that is most important. And I guess with victims, the thing I see as the major thing which needs to be worked on is making our criminal justice system more responsive to that experience, which it isn't right now. And yes, there will be people, and I guess I'm making also a distinction between there's sort of a moral forgiveness versus a risk level as a system. You know, in some cases, you may know that the person who victimized you isn't going to do it again, but you still don't have to like them, right? So there's sort of different perspectives on looking at it. You don't have to invite them to your Christmas party, even if they're not likely to reoffend. So I think that you have to deal with the complex emotions of being victimized and your decisions about what type of relationships you want to have with these people in the future.
We've done so good, Dr. Hanson. I feel inclined to throw you just one last question.
Okay.
And it's still about the advocates, right? But it's about their work, right? How do you suggest that advocates approach and present this information to legislators who might only have political ambitions in mind rather than following this data? Many lawmakers understand that recidivism is low. However, it is political suicide to reform sex offense laws.
Well, I often take it as sort of an economic or practical. You know, there is an identifiable group of individuals who have a sex offense history, who the evidence, the stuff that I reviewed, that they are not meaningfully higher risk than a large group of other people. And I think we can safely, and I guess I'd say that, safely sort of de-emphasize or get sort of chunk those people off and use our attention and our money to actually do things that matter, that actually will make a difference. So it's a differentiating within that group.
Dr. Hanson, this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you for letting our audience ask you, I think, what was about 24 questions we fired at you in the past half hour. So any final words or thoughts from you before I close this out?
No, thank you all for participating. Again, I'm one voice in a discussion, and may you continue talking and thinking about it.
Yes, as Dr. Hanson said, continue asking, continue learning, continue connecting. Once again, my name is Dr. Danielle Cooper. I bring you greetings from the University of New Haven. I once again want to thank our sponsors for this event, One Standard of Justice. Thank you so much, Cindy, for all of the work that you and others put together to bring this event. And thank you, of course, Senator Gary Winfield, for your contributions in coordinating this event. Yeah. I hope you all have a great evening or afternoon, wherever you are. It's still morning here in Connecticut. Yeah. And know that we will be reaching out once we have a recording and other information to share with you. Thank you so much.